morning, good afternoon, good evening. Well, not good night, but welcome everybody. We don't know when you're going to be playing this video clip, but I'm sitting here in a conversation with Bevan Sylvester, who's well known to you. We're colleagues together at Somerset West United Church, and we're going to be speaking about chapter 3. Bevan, how are you doing? All right?
I'm okay, thanks, George. And you?
No, we're fit and strong, just frustrated.
Ditto.
But Bevan and I had our first experience today of going back to the church to record the sermon, and that was a lot of fun. It's pretty tough sitting here at home, you know, with your cell phone stacked up on books and things to be able to take the sermon. It was nicer to do it in the familiar place of the church. So Bevan, we're looking today in this fourth in the series at chapter 3 of Peter's letter. We've done a bit of groundwork already, a couple of weeks now. We're looking at this letter supposedly written by Peter, and we said that at first it looked a bit weird because the Greek is so fancy, and we didn't know whether a fisherman could manage to write in such Greek. But when we went lower down in chapter 5, we discovered that he was writing together with Silas. And Silas, we know, is the companion of Paul, a very educated person, somebody called a prophet, went with Paul to Corinth and other places. So together they wrote that letter, and they're writing to the Christians in the north of Turkey. And he spells out the areas, and they're all up there in the north of Turkey. So we know who wrote it and where it was written to, and we also think, Bevan, that it was quite an early letter because the references to the end times are still very strong. And those early letters, the Christians felt like the end was coming soon. But I'm sure we'll talk a bit more about that. But I'm fascinated how you drew the straw to speak with me in a conversation about this first section, because it describes the I don't know, hierarchy or what in the home, but how did you draw the straw?
Probably because I have no marital experience, George.
Okay, so you're the best one then.
The expert will have to advise us a little bit on that one.
No, I don't think one has to be married to be an expert. Like I told you, you don't have to be dead to do a funeral. You can do it. But it's fascinating. He starts out, and this is so reminiscent of Paul's letter to the Ephesians, chapter 5. It starts, he says, "Wives, in the same way, be submissive to your husbands, so that if any of them do not believe the word, they may be won over without words, but by the behavior." Sure. Now, the trick about Ephesians 5, as I keep reminding brides at weddings, is that the submission that comes in 5:22 is in the context of 5:21, which says, "Submit to one another out of reverence for Christ." So the submission goes two ways. But why do you think why do you think Peter is so interested in the domestic situation of these Christians he's writing to?
George, I've been wondering that myself. I think he is so passionate about wanting to form people into a Christ-likeness. One can see that throughout his letter, when he emphasizes being different, being holy, being other. And I think he tries to build on that theme in this chapter as well, particularly when it comes to a Christian marriage being likened to Christ's relationship with the church. You know, in Revelation, we have quite a bit of symbolism talking about that, how the bride should be ready, beautifully prepared for her husband, etc., etc. But I always emphasize, as you have just done, passages like the Ephesians verse, just to make sure that we don't end up with theology that doesn't make sense, particularly 2,000 years later. Yeah, you know. But I think Peter here comes down to very real business, wanting to make sure that our Christianity, our faith, seeps through into every area of our lives, including our relationships, and particularly our marriage covenants we have with with our partners we have for life.
Sure. So there's no area of our lives that fall outside of our behavior as Christians. Even in the privacy of the home, there
Yes.
should be such, our lifestyle should reflect. And we're going to try and put it up here. So we're, let me just see, sharing the screen and then, okay.
What are your thoughts on that first part, George?
Well, it's very interesting to me, Bevan, to hear this here. And when I read between the lines, I think that Peter is writing into a situation that Christianity has caused, a problem that Christianity has created. And I'll tell you what that problem is. That problem is that there might have been women in this area in the north of Turkey, in all of that broad area across, who converted to the faith, but who had husbands that were still pagan, who followed the Roman religion,
Okay.
or the local religion of that area. And now you have a situation where in the home you have somebody believing in Christ and somebody who does not. And I don't think I think the advice that Peter is giving is that if these women want to have a positive impact in their families, they need to do so by being very careful about their faith. I'm just assuming that because it's a very early letter, that there are situations where, people like Lydia in Philippi and some of the ones mentioned in Romans 16, those ladies might not have been in relationships where their life partner was a Christian. And so Peter is saying, hang on, I don't want you to be flashy about this. I don't want you to be arrogant.
Yeah.
I want you to have an aim of winning over your husband to the faith. Because he goes on, if you look at the screen there, they may be won over without words by the behavior of their wives.
Yes. Yes. But did you see that in verse 7, he actually addresses the husbands? So they're not quite off the hook.
Right. That's absolutely
true. He says, in the
true.
same way, be considerate as you live with your wives. Treat them with respect, etc., etc.
Yes. Yeah. Now, Paul in Ephesians would go a step further, and he would liken the behavior of the husband to the relationship between Christ and the church, as you've pointed out. So he would say, as Christ gave his life for the church, so husbands ought to give their life for their wives. Now, that is the supreme sacrifice, isn't it?
Yes, very much so. And hopefully one day I will be able to participate in that supreme sacrifice, George.
Well, I think that we exercise our sacrificial love in so many different ways, not just a marriage relationship.
George, I agree. I must say, as I read these first verses, 1 to 7, it's so easy to get caught up in the gender thing, wives versus husbands, etc., etc. And one can easily overlook verse 4, which for me is such a striking verse, where Peter says that one's beauty has to come from the inside, for that is something that God treasures. And I always think that that's a verse that we can't take lightly, or just skip as if it doesn't matter.
Now, that was very humorous to me, because if you go back to verse 3, you see your beauty should not come from outward adornment, such as elaborate hairstyles and wearing a golden jewelry. And I tell you why it was humorous. I once read that the Roman Emperor Augustus, he passed a law forbidding jewelry over a certain amount. So you could only use X amount in the gold, so many ounces, because the rich people in Rome at that time, the very high society, the very wealthy people, were displaying their wives up and down the streets.
God.
Very fancy clothing and lots of jewelry as a sign of their wealth. So they would be the talk of the town. So he passed this, but listen to this, Bevan, here's the funny part. He passed this law, but the woman protests. Now, in that age, for a woman to go into the streets in protest, they had a protest. And so large and powerful was the protest, Bevan, that they had to withdraw the law. Can you believe it?
Good grief.
had to withdraw the law because the women protest about them being limited in terms of their jewelry and outfits.
Oh, so they really wanted to splash out, eh?
That's it.
Goodness
That's it.
me.
And the pressure on
Nothing,
Augustus.
nothing shocks me anymore, George.
You know, you think of the Caesar of Rome being all powerful. Well, a bunch of women got him to withdraw the law. You know, because when the senators and so on got home, life was not worth living. So
Yeah. Hell hath no fury, hey?
yes, yeah, quite. So Bevan, the one thing that strikes me before we leave this section, the one thing that strikes me here is that Peter is using 6 verses to speak to the women, but only 1 verse to speak to the men. And
I was hoping you weren't going to refer to that, George.
So without getting into the ins and outs of submissiveness and that, which, you know, I think probably have very good reasons culturally, I put myself in their shoes and I'm thinking to myself, if you are a woman who converts to Christianity and you're married to a non-Christian man, it's a heck of a lot different from if the husband converts, because in those days, Bevan, if the husband converted, the whole family was converted, not so.
Yeah. Yeah. For me, the words "in the same way" stand out.
Yes.
At the beginning of verse 7, where it says husbands, and then "in the same way." So I see that as Peter's way of saying, in the same way as I have explained in the first 6 verses.
Yes.
Go back and apply those to yourselves.
Yes.
So, you know, so I don't think it's that easy for husbands just to say, okay, we only get 1 verse and we give them mighty sigh of relief, you know?
Right. Okay, no, fair enough. What he doesn't say in the 6 or the 7 verses is that the Christian wife who's converted needs to leave her husband. He doesn't say that. So it's not, okay, he's a heathen, he's going to hell, you can leave him. But what he does say is that the wives should do the more difficult thing, and that is to stay married and be a good wife. And in the process, the influence that you have may even cause another conversion, which is your husband and your sons and your daughters and so on. You may you may be evangelist in your own home.
Yeah. And we've seen that often, hey, in our circles of friends, in our families, in our congregations, the power of influence. The question, of course, always comes, George, you know, to what extent should that be the norm, you know?
Yes.
You know, one has also seen lots of females whose lives are absolutely nightmarish.
Yes.
Yeah, it's a difficult one for me as a pastor, I must say.
No, you're absolutely right. And there are no simple answers. But I do want to ask you what you think, though, about the general notion that's being communicated here. And that is that we are able, we who are Christians, we who follow Christ, are able to exert an influence on others. And that our lives may very well be a stronger witness than our words. What do you think of that?
Yes. Yeah, just before I comment on that, George, let me just say that I have seen some beautiful impact, so to speak, of God-fearing wives, praying wives, wives who worship at the church, who serve in the church, who did not give up. And that's always such a thrill for me to see when some wives are able to walk the journey, you know, until change and transformation come. Yeah. So I suppose that is the power of influence, isn't it?
It is. And
mothers, the power of love's impact, the power of the impact of gentleness, of being merciful, of being compassionate, of being patient, of being generous of spirit. It goes back to the fruit of the Spirit to a large extent, Galatians 5.
Yeah.
I think we who are church leaders are in the privileged positions of often seeing the influence our flock would have on the larger community, the people we lead and the people we teach.
Yes.
And that's always very rewarding,
Right. Um,
Um,
I had a little thing in one of my sermons that I preached on First Peter. Well, there were two really. The first one was Flannery O'Connor, the poet, who wrote that his in-laws started attending church because the service was so horrible that they knew there must be something else there. How'd you like that? They couldn't have been talking
okay.
about our church, eh? Not our church, Bevan.
Yeah. No,
And,
never, never Somerset West United, that's for sure.
and then C.S. Lewis said a similar thing once. He says the hymns were like fifth-rate poems set to sixth-rate music. They can't be
Oh,
talking
God.
about the Wesleyan hymns. It's not
Oh,
possible.
never. No,
But,
not in a million
but
years.
so the singing was so bad. But then Lewis said when he went to church, he saw somebody sitting there, a humble old saint of some description, and he realized that he wasn't fit to wear that guy's shoes.
Sure.
So,
Sure.
so there's something else, and that something else may be the influence.
Yeah, George, I think there's a danger here. And the danger for me is that sometimes we underestimate the influence we can have on another life,
Right.
the impact we can make on somebody who is in need or somebody who's searching for truth, looking for Jesus. Sometimes the results of our influence are not immediately seen
Sure.
or immediately visible. Sometimes the seed we sow or the witness we bear only pays off years after, decades
Yes.
after.
Right.
So I would like to encourage us to persevere and to endure, to not think, gosh, the influence I'm trying to make is not happening.
Yeah.
I was trying to make an impact. There's no change. There's no real sign of anything taking place. So I'm just going to call it a day. I'm
Right.
out of here. We must never underestimate what God is able to do with the influence we try to make.
Yeah. I must confess to you, Bevan, when we talk about influence, I've always tried to walk a very fine line on the influence that a minister has. On the one hand, it irritates me when people expect people like you and I to behave in a certain way, and when when they are scandalized by very ordinary behavior. If you have a whiskey, then that's not something a minister should do. Or if you
Why do
tell
you
it,
choose the drink that I prefer, George?
and if you
Of all the drinks you could mention, you had to say whiskey, eh?
and then if you tell a slightly off-color joke, they think it's untoward. Now, I mean, it is. I say it's a fine line because I think there's certain things in which we have to, not be a stumbling block, to people. I think if we behaved very poorly, then that would be a stumbling block to people. But on the other hand, when they have a caricature of what a minister should be and they discover a very ordinary person, they're sometimes disappointed. Do you hear what I'm saying?
Yeah, and in my case, they are often disappointed when they discover that I've got clay feet, Yeah, George, this is something that I continue to struggle with, after 18 years of ministry. Because on the other hand, I do try to live my life as much as in the Jesus way as is possible, as to be an example. But I always remind people that although I try to follow Jesus, I am not Jesus. So the fine line is that I can fail and Jesus will never fail. And
Yes.
those who are in our churches, those who are part of our congregations, need to always just remember that.
Yes.
And so that I can have my whiskey in peace without thinking I'm letting anybody down.
Yeah, but Jesus also had saved his sternest words for the Pharisees. And what he often had trouble with the Pharisees is that they would behave in a certain way, but their hearts would be in a different place. So they weren't real, they weren't authentic.
Yeah.
And I don't want to be inauthentic. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I mean, for them to have been called whitewashed tombs by Jesus and a brood of vipers is quite a serious accusation, And I agree with you. It goes about being unreal.
Yes.
So I would rather be real and not perfect than end up like the Pharisees. for me, it goes back to that verse 4, George.
Yes.
1 Peter 3 verse 4, where it says, your beauty has to come from within.
That's right. Yes, quite right.
That, I think I'm paraphrasing a bit, but
no,
yeah,
but
that's what it is.
That's spot on. Yeah. Okay, let's just have a look at the next little section. I'm going to bring it up here.
While you're looking for that, George, I just want to add this quick thing regarding impact and having an impact.
Yes.
We must also know that sometimes the impact we have is small.
Yes.
Small but significant. We don't always have to have a massive, overwhelming impact. We must touch lives in significant ways and meaningful ways, rather than with all the fireworks, you know?
Right. So now, if I extrapolate from the text, how are some of the ways that we can influence, whether we're a husband, a wife, a brother, sister, parent, child, doesn't matter, ordinary friend? I've taken the 6 things out of this passage that relate to influencing. So the first one, live in harmony. Now, you can imagine if you're living in a non-Christian world where the Christian church was very tiny in Asia Minor and up at the top of Turkey there, living in harmony with people would take some effort, wouldn't it?
Yes, yeah. And we are not even in New Testament Turkey today, and sometimes that is a challenge, eh?
Yes, quite right.
And even with us being mostly surrounded by Christian people as part of our lives, that can still be quite a quest.
Yes, but it's interesting. When I read this, Bevan, I thought about that letter to the exiles that God speaks through Jeremiah. And when they are probably expecting him to say, okay, I'm going to liberate you from living among the Babylonians, he says, settle down.
Yeah.
Give your children in marriage, etc. And I guess there could be a similar sense in which Peter has to break the unfortunate news that the end of the world may not be coming as soon as the early Christians had hoped. So they need to settle down. They need to live in harmony. You know, the second one, be sympathetic. Yeah. Well, I mean, what is it going to take to be sympathetic to pagans?
Yeah. There's also the other extreme, George. Sometimes it's easier to be sympathetic towards unbelievers than believers, considering that some believers can really misbehave, you know.
Yeah.
I want to say with this list that is in front of us, you know, as we go through them, I can see now already that all of them are powerful sentiments, showing sympathy, living in harmony, loving one another, expressing compassion. These are all gifts, if I can call it that, which will help heal and change the world.
Yes.
So for me, this is it's so comforting to see this list. Firstly, they're all doable, and secondly, it just speaks of Jesus. It just screams Jesus very clearly that if you want to tick all these boxes, try and follow Jesus and do as he taught, and then you will get it right.
Right. And you know, in this COVID-19 lockdown, whatever that we're going through now, I've seen a lot of things on social media and messages sent to me, emails written, which really are very selfish. And I've had to confront that in myself as well. You know, it's inconvenient not to be able to go and see my family in Belleville, or inconvenient not to be able to walk on the beach or go up the nature reserve here at Helderberg or whatever. And I'm very easily angered by those inconveniences. And here we have a sense, Paul is communicating a sense, not only must we live in harmony with people, which is often the opposite of selfishness, but we must also be sympathetic to them. That's even closer. And then to go further, he wants us to, at Philadelphia, that Greek word means brotherly love. Now, we often think, okay, if we are loving towards the people in the chairs on Sunday, on either side of us, or the other members of the church, or members of our families, that's enough. But really what the intention is here is for us to be loving towards those that are not like us, who don't believe the same things we do,
Yeah.
those that we might even be, diametrically opposed to. I mean, I don't know what the Good Samaritan is for members of our church. Is it a Muslim? Is it a terrorist? Is it a black person?
An unbeliever? An unbeliever?
Unbeliever, a member of the ANC, a politician? I don't know. You can make a long list, but it's a bitter pill to swallow when Peter's telling us to live in harmony with them, to be sympathetic towards them, to put ourselves in their shoes, and to love them.
When the church does get it right, George, it is an amazing thing. John 13, I think it is, John 13 verse 34, where Jesus says, a new commandment I give unto you, that you love one another, because by this the world will know that you are my disciples.
Yes.
So the world shouldn't be recognizing us by how often we meet for worship in a fancy building, but the world should recognize us as Jesus followers by how we love them and how we love each other within the church. That is testimony at its best for me.
Right.
When other people are drawn to Jesus because how we love each other.
Yes, quite right. And this be compassionate, which is the fourth point that comes out of this section. I had a look in the Greek, and it's the same word used of Jesus at the death of Lazarus. When it says that he felt in his splonchna, he felt in his guts. And you know how it is, Bevan, when there's been a tragedy, or somebody's hurting, or there's been a death or something, you feel it in your stomach here. You know, you almost feel sick.
Yes, in your gut.
Yes. So the word is eusplangnoi. When you must be compassionate,
Gosh, you're going to have to spell that for me, George.
but it's in your tummy, in your guts, where you feel this connection with somebody. That's what it is to be compassionate. When somebody's crying, you feel
to feel with. Am I right?
Oh, that's right. Yes.
To feel with another person.
Yes. It's a very physical feeling, and then humility, and of course forgiveness, which is the hallmark of our faith, isn't it?
Yeah. At the beginning of our discussion, I said that this list looked very doable. Now I'm not so sure. It's a heck of a list, eh?
It is. It's a great challenge.
That forgiveness bit.
Yes, that's hard. So let me go on here.
Not to mention the humility bit.
Right, yes. So
now let's go on, George, please.
Yes, there is a beautiful piece in this passage that is often honed in on. You know, sometimes we've got a piece of scripture which we hone in on, that we remember. And this one, in the NIV, it says, be ready to give an answer for the hope that you have. I put Eugene Peterson's Message version up here, just to give us a slightly different take on it. Be ready to speak up and tell anyone who asks you why you're living the way you are. And always with the utmost courtesy. What do you think of this challenge of Peter to the early Christians living in Asia Minor to be ready to give an answer?
Yeah, well, I'm quite taken by Peterson's way of putting it here in the Message. It definitely puts another spin on it. Be ready to speak up and tell anyone who asks you why you're living the way you are. It makes me think of how very few people are busy asking me why I'm living the way I am. Maybe I'm not quite at the point where I'm getting it right. I suppose, George, being ready takes quite a bit of courage, you know. I meet so many people in our churches that are just not confident enough or brave enough to stand up or to testify or even pray out loud. And one always has to kind of, you know, we who shepherd them, I always try and just reassure them that it's okay to not yet be at that place of readiness. I think Peter makes this sound like a matter of urgency. You know, he doesn't beat around the bush. He says, "Be ready." For me, you know, to take the easy way out, I would say that it's something that we all need to work on. To be ready to speak for Christ wherever, whenever, to be ready, as Paul says, in season and out of season. Because sometimes we caught unawares, with our pants down, not ready to minister in any situation.
Yes.
And that's probably where I need to grow in a bit of alertness and awareness.
Although I think sometimes, as he mentioned earlier, our behavior, our example, transcends words. So it's not always, but in this case, I think it's an encouragement to the early Christians living up there in a society that was predominantly pagan. It's an encouragement for them to be, firstly, to have the courage to speak up when that might result in negative consequences. Secondly, for them to think through their faith in such a way that they might have something to say. And I guess that can be true for us as well. When it says be ready, what I'm hearing is, if somebody asks you about your faith, be able to say something. It doesn't have to be fancy. I always think that Jesus never called us to be an expert witness. He called us just to be a witness. And an expert witness is maybe somebody who knows about ballistics and, all those fingerprints and things like that. But a witness is just saying, the crime happened like this. It's very simple. I heard Oscar Pistorius, that night, and he was shouting this and that. So,
or I saw.
I saw. Yeah. And so maybe
I felt.
I felt as well as maybe we could say, this is what God has done for me. The man who was healed of his blindness in John's Gospel. He says, look,
the man born blind.
Yeah. He says to the Pharisee, look, I was blind and now I see. What more must I tell you? I can't explain whether it was the mud or the spit or whether it was magic or whatever. That's not for me to say. But I can tell you I was blind, and here I am, I can see. So that's sort of being ready,
Yeah, George, you are reminding me of when I was a youth pastor 17 or 18 years ago, working with teenagers. And then already they were having friends of other faiths, friends that didn't know the Lord, and it became a very sensitive thing. So I told them that the starting point for the story they tell about their faith needs to be that children's chorus, Jesus loves me, this I know, for the Bible tells me so.
Simple.
So if we have nothing else to say, maybe we can use that as an introduction,
Absolutely.
We know that Jesus loves us, for the Bible tells us so.
Yes. But
and that's the long and the short of it.
Yeah. When I look at this, Bevan, Paul, at least Peter, qualifies it by saying what we say must be reasonable. It must be sent with gentleness.
Yeah.
It must be sent with said with reverence. And then finally, our behavior must support it. So don't say things if you're not prepared to live it. Isn't that interesting?
Yeah. I love that.
Yes.
The proof is in the pudding.
Do this with gentleness and respect. I'm reading from verse 15 now. Keep a clear conscience so that those who speak maliciously against your good behavior in Christ may be ashamed of their slander. So whenever you give an answer, whenever you give a testimony to what's happening with you, let it be reasonable so that it can be understood. Be gentle in your words. And often, Christian evangelists are often not known for their gentleness. They really, when you watch some of these evangelists go off, boy, they're putting it into
They're known for the opposite, I'm afraid.
Yes, that's right. With reverence and knowing that you're talking about something you don't fully understand, maybe. And then finally, your behavior must support it, which is fair enough.
Yeah. I love that bit, as difficult as it is to swallow. Your money has to be where your mouth is. Live the gospel.
That's right.
It's easy to say things, but if you live it, that's where the evidence lies.
Yeah. And then finally on this section, Bevan, I love Peterson's how he ends off this verse 17. He says, when people throw mud at you, none of it will stick. They'll end up realizing that they're the ones who need a bath. Isn't that a beautiful way?
Yeah.
Yeah, it's such a lovely way of doing it.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Um,
Only Peterson can get away with it, eh?
yes, I guess so. I guess so. So then the last section in this, in fact, it takes up pretty much half of the chapter, is the question of suffering for doing good. That's in the NIV. I know that he comes back to suffering time and time again, because in chapter 4, which I'm going to discuss next week, it's also suffering for being a Christian. But in this context, he says in verse 14, he says, even if you suffer for what is right, you are blessed. So how do you reconcile this, Bevan? How can one be blessed and be suffering at the same time?
George, do you want me to write a thesis on this? The age-old question on suffering and hardship. My mind goes to James chapter 1. In the old translation, it says, consider it all great joy when hardships come your way, because then you grow strong. There's also Paul talking about it in Romans 5, saying
Yes.
that suffering develops patience, patience develops perseverance, etc., etc. So I always focus on the growth point. And luckily or unluckily, I have been through enough pain in the ministry and enough suffering on my Christian walk to know that those end up being the most remarkable points of growth. For that's where God meets one in one's brokenness. That's where God accommodates one in one's loneliness. That is where God seems to do most of his pruning, most of his shaping, most of his molding. So yeah, I never discard pain or suffering just as pain or suffering. For me, it is always a promising opportunity for growth.
Yes.
Firstly, as a Jesus follower, and then as a person at large, as a human being.
Right. Bevan, it does go against the prosperity gospel, though, doesn't it? Because there are a lot of Christians in the world today who believe that that suffering is a sign of sin or disobedience to God, and blessing, which is seen through financial and other ways, that can be a sign of God's approval of your behavior, your lifestyle, and your following. So, I mean, there's a lot of uncertainty in the Christian community about the notion of suffering and being blessed, isn't there?
Yes, very much so. And I came to a point long time ago where I negated the prosperity preaching simply because I had started spending much time amongst the poor and amongst the desperate, amongst the suffering and the most vulnerable of our society. And I saw there very clearly that the kingdom of God is alive and well in those areas, amongst those people. One doesn't have to be rich or healthy or happy to experience God's presence or to experience God's love or God's grace. Yeah. And I say this confidently because I've seen it with my own eyes, you know?
Right.
Yeah.
Bevan, there are two things that come to mind for me I want to share with you. The one is that at the end of Hebrews, I think it's the end of chapter 12, beginning chapter 13, there is a discussion by the writer to the Hebrews about, I think, 9 different things that won't change, that are eternal. He starts the discussion by talking about the shakeable kingdom. And boy, have you and I experienced the shakes since March the 26th, because never I don't know about you, Bevan, but never in my life would I have ever predicted that it would be possible for the regular worship on Sunday mornings to come to an end and to change in such a dramatic fashion in a very short space of time. Yeah. So the shakeable kingdom, and then the writer to the Hebrews says, but okay, we are now inheriting a kingdom that cannot be shaken, and here are 9 things. marriage, worship, blah, blah, blah. And right there at the end, suffering. And I'm thinking
Sure.
to myself, wow, what a scary thing to think that
Yes.
suffering, or at least the consequence of suffering, the wounds in the hands and side, are eternal.
Yeah.
They may not be hurtful in glory, but they are there. And so that makes me think that maybe suffering is something that needs to be understood and not avoided. So that's the
Sure.
first thing. And then the
Sure.
other thought I had, Bevan, a very small thing. I once read a book by James Dobson, the psychologist, and it was called "Why Do Why Do Good Things Happen to Bad
Why do
Things Happen?"
bad things happen to good people?
Oh, no. It's called When God Doesn't Make Sense. Sorry, When God Doesn't
Oh.
Make Sense.
The
And
other
in
one is
that,
by the Jewish rabbi.
and then
Yeah.
in that,
Yeah.
he writes a story of a little boy who had an infection in his ear. And the pus was coming out there, and it was a very bad ear infection. And his father had to take him to the specialist, and there they were sitting. And the specialist said to the father, "Okay, I mean, it must have been a small child." So the specialist said, "Now you need to hold him because I need to get this bud into the ear to clean out the pus, and then I'm going to give you medication and it'll heal." And James Dobson said when he looked at that child's face, the child was saying, of course he was crying terribly, "Why are you doing this to me?" And he says that gives us an insight into God's feelings when we suffer. We
Sure.
sometimes think God is doing it to us. Meantime, he's the one holding us while the pain is happening so that healing can take place. And it gave me a new dimension on suffering. I began to think that maybe if,
I love that.
yeah,
I love that because George, you've also been a minister for a long time. That this is the age-old issue that we try to address, at the bedside in the hospital
yeah,
or in a chemo ward,
yes,
or at the funeral of a child.
yes,
That it's such a struggle to make sense of suffering.
yes.
But I love your story.
Mm.
God is the one holding us
And
while
maybe
we suffer.
And maybe when some years have gone by and we look back, then we will be able to look at that experience that we had that was very painful and see some sort of meaning come out of it. You know?
Yes, because I can't imagine that God would let anything that hurtful go to waste.
Yeah.
Because God makes all things beautiful in their time.
In this time. Yes, quite right.
Um,
Okay.
so even if we come to that conclusion later on in our lives, that
Yes.
maybe that there was something worthwhile there, just imagine the discovery when we get to glory, George, and when
Yes.
things start making sense to us and the
Yes.
puzzle pieces all fit together.
Quite right.
I
Yes.
think that will be indescribably wonderful.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. Let's go back to the text here for a second. I just want to see, I think I've got a last little thing for us to talk about. Yes. Right at the end, Bevan, if you look up at the text there,
Yeah,
Peter's writing, and we're back to the NIV here, to those who were disobedient long ago when God waited patiently in the days of Noah while the ark was being built. In it, only a few people, 8 in all, were saved through water. And this symbolizes baptism that now saves you also. Not the removal of the dirt from the body, but the pledge of a clear conscience toward God. It saves you by the resurrection of Jesus Christ. And it's interesting to me that Peter would draw an analogy between the flood of Noah, which was supposed to wash the earth clean of sin,
yeah.
and baptism. I mean, how does it sit with you?
George, I must be quite honest with you. I'm not, I'm not all familiar with this concept.
Hmm.
I don't know what to do with it. Um, yeah, tell me what you're thinking, and then I'll
So,
add or take away.
okay, so as far as I can work out, everybody for everybody, baptism is a little bit different. I know that in the mainline churches, the Catholic and Anglican and Methodist, Presbyterian, Congregational, all those sorts of traditions, baptism is an initiation into the family of God. That's the primary focus. It's not the washing away of sin. That is a focus, but it comes secondary. But we become part of God's family. He adopts us as his own. But what Peter is doing here is he's looking at that secondary meaning, that with baptism, there is a symbolic washing away. The water is to wash away sin. So the child comes with original sin, and then you wash away. Or the adult comes, never having been baptized before, with not only original sin, but all of their accumulated sin. And the symbolism of baptism is to wash away that sin. Peter is actually making that fairly emphatic in this. He's saying, just as with Noah, everybody was in the boat and the water washed away the evil, so baptism washes away sin. And then he says, because you're saved by the resurrection of Jesus. It's nothing that you've done. The water itself has no effect apart from this resurrection of
And
Jesus.
that is why the baptism is a sacrament of grace, because it's not of what we do ourselves.
Yes.
Or have done for ourselves. Yeah.
It's a spiritual
I find this very dramatic, the Peter going all the way back to Noah in Genesis. Yeah.
Okay, but remember, he's talking to new Christians. He's talking to Christians in a foreign society. He's also talking to people in a world where there were all kinds of fertility cults, and they had the Dionysius thing with when the harvest came. There was terrible drunkenness and things like that. And these Christians are trying to behave differently. And so he's saying, well, you might be inside the ark, when the water comes, at least you will be safe. And why are you safe? Because you were baptized into the faith.
Yes.
Anyway, it's an interesting passage, isn't it, Bevan?
Yeah, very much so.
And I know it's going to be one that you're going to be preaching on soon, from this 1 Peter 3.
Yes.
Fortunately,
I'm collecting some ideas, George, from what we've said.
Great. Well, I've so enjoyed this time.
Leaning some thoughts.
Thank you for being, it's not novel for you to be my conversation companion, because you and I do that all the time. And as always, it's a great joy to be in conversation.
Yeah, you always pull out your heavy Greek on me, George.
But thank you for the time, Bevan, and I hope our congregation will enjoy this Bible study that we're doing.
My pleasure. What a joy for me to be with you, George.
Great. Okay.
God bless.
All right. Thanks, Bevan.